The elderly man walked slowly into the busy airport, his movements careful and deliberate. With his gray hair, wrinkled face, and the weathered look that comes with age, he seemed like just another traveler. However, something about him stood out. He didn't rush to any of the counters or look around for a gate. Instead, he made his way to a quiet corner of the terminal, pulling a large, heavy suitcase behind him. The airport was buzzing with activity. Passengers hurried to catch their flights. Families greeted loved ones returning home, and the sounds of announcements filled the air. But the elderly man barely noticed. He sat down in an empty chair by the window, his suitcase at his side, and stared out at the planes parked outside. No one seemed to pay much attention to him at first. After all, airports were full of people, and it was not uncommon to see someone sit and wait for a long time. But as hours went by, something strange started to happen. The elderly man hadn't moved. He simply stayed there, staring out the window, occasionally reaching into his bag for a snack. He didn't seem tired or bothered by the hustle around him. The longer he sat, the more out of place he seemed. Most passengers either left for their flights or were picked up by family members. But not him. He remained where he was, day after day. Airport security, always on the lookout for unusual behavior, began to take notice. They kept an eye on him through the security cameras, but he never caused any trouble. He didn't speak to anyone or ask for help. Yet something about him caught their attention. Why wasn't he trying to leave? Why wasn't he looking for a way to board a plane like everyone else? Security officers began to whisper among themselves. Perhaps he was waiting for a flight, they thought. But he didn't seem to be in any rush. Maybe he had been lost, they considered. But no one had reported a missing passenger. The more they watched him, the more questions arose. They had seen him arrive at the airport, but there was no record of a flight for him. No one knew why he had come or what he was doing there. Hours turned into a full day, then two. Still, the elderly man remained seated, like he had nowhere else to go. He was still calm, his eyes distant, and he showed no signs of discomfort. But to the airport staff, the situation was starting to feel more unusual with each passing hour. Security personnel were puzzled. Why would anyone sit at an airport for so long without any clear purpose? What was this elderly man waiting for? At this point, more than just the security officers were beginning to wonder. The airport staff started to talk to each other, noticing the strange behavior of the elderly man. They exchanged theories. Perhaps he was confused, or maybe he had lost his family and couldn't find them. But no one knew for sure. The elderly man, it seemed, was an enigma. Everyone assumed that eventually he would get up, look for help, or speak to someone. But he didn't. He just stayed there, sitting in the same chair, with his eyes fixed on the planes outside. The terminal continued to buzz with activity, but he remained a still, quiet presence, as if waiting for something, or someone, to find him. As more time passed, the mystery of the elderly man grew. He was like a puzzle that no one had the answer to, and everyone in the airport, from the staff to the passengers, began to wonder who he was and why he had chosen to stay in that spot for so long. The story was just beginning, and no one could have predicted what would happen next. As the days passed, the elderly man's presence in the airport continued to stir curiosity. On the second day, airport staff couldn't help but notice that he hadn't moved from his spot. He still sat by the window, his suitcase next to him, as though he were waiting for someone or something. Despite the constant flow of travelers around him, he remained motionless. His posture never changed, and his eyes, though distant, seemed fixed on the planes outside. It was a quiet kind of determination, and it only added to the mystery. Passengers came and went, rushing to catch their flights, but the elderly man showed no interest in joining them. He didn't check his watch, nor did he seem concerned about time. He simply remained there, almost blending into the busy airport, yet standing out because of his stillness. Some of the airport employees tried to offer help, but the man just smiled politely and said, "I'm fine, thank you." It was as if he were in his own world, one that didn't quite match the busy reality around him. The terminal was full of life, with people hurrying to check in, waiting for flights, or saying goodbye to loved ones. Yet, the elderly man seemed unaffected by all of it. He didn't seem tired, nor did he appear to need anything, despite his long wait. Security continued to monitor him through the cameras, growing more intrigued. It wasn't normal for anyone to wait so long without purpose, without a destination or a clear reason for being there. They had to figure out what was going on. A few staff members took turns walking past him, offering him a drink or asking if he needed assistance, but every time, the elderly man politely declined. He didn't want anything. He didn't seem like a typical passenger who might be waiting for a delayed flight. There was something more to it, something that wasn't quite right, and that feeling grew stronger each day. The more time passed, the more concerned the staff became. The elderly man's behavior wasn't violent or alarming, but it was strange. It seemed like he was waiting for something or someone, but it was unclear who or what that could be. Had he lost his way? Was he confused? Was he simply waiting for a flight that never came? Security wasn't sure, but they were starting to feel that something needed to be done. The man couldn't just remain there indefinitely without any explanation. By the third day, the elderly man still hadn't moved. The staff had tried everything from offering assistance to suggesting that he might need help with his luggage or booking a flight. Yet every time they asked, he would smile and decline. The staff exchanged nervous glances. His calmness was both puzzling and worrying. Airport protocol typically didn't cover this kind of situation. It wasn't an emergency, but it didn't feel normal either. And so, the tension continued to build. The elderly man seemed content in his quiet corner, while those around him were becoming more and more unsure about how to handle him. Everyone in the airport had started to wonder, why was he still here? Why didn't he want to leave? And why hadn't he told anyone what he was waiting for? His silence seemed to hang in the air, and it left a trail of unanswered questions behind it. As the hours passed and the days grew longer, one thing became clear. The elderly man's story was far from simple, and the longer he stayed, the more certain everyone was that it wasn't just a misunderstanding or an innocent wait. Something was going on, something that no one at the airport could yet understand. By the third day, airport security had finally decided that something needed to be done. The elderly man's presence, now more pronounced with each passing hour, was starting to draw more attention. Staff members who had walked past him before now exchanged uneasy glances. They had to get to the bottom of this, but they weren't sure how to approach him. The elderly man still sat quietly, his large suitcase by his side, and his eyes focused on the window, staring out at the planes. He didn't seem troubled or restless, but the longer he remained there without moving, the more concerned everyone became. Airport security officers, accustomed to dealing with strange situations, knew that this wasn't normal. People didn't just sit in airports for days without a reason. At least, not without eventually asking for help or moving on. One of the younger officers, a recent recruit, decided it was time to talk to the elderly man again. He had seen him sitting there for hours, and it was becoming impossible to ignore his presence any longer. Taking a deep breath, the officer walked over to the elderly man, determined to get some answers. This time, he would try a different approach. "Excuse me, sir," the officer began, trying to sound friendly and non-intrusive. "Is there anything I can help you with? You've been here for a while, and we just want to make sure everything is okay." The elderly man slowly turned his head to face the officer. His gaze was calm, almost serene. And for a moment, the officer felt as if he were speaking to someone lost in their own world. "I'm waiting for someone," the elderly man replied, his voice soft but steady. The officer raised an eyebrow, confused. "Waiting for someone?" he asked. "Do you need assistance? I can help you find your family or book a flight." The elderly man shook his head gently. "No, thank you. I'm fine. I'm just waiting for them to come." He spoke with such quiet certainty that it seemed like he knew something no one else did. The officer felt a knot tighten in his stomach. There was something strange about the man's tone. It wasn't that he sounded lost or disoriented, but something about his calmness made the officer feel uneasy. It was as though the elderly man had been waiting for something, or someone, longer than anyone could understand. "Sir, it's been 3 days now. Are you sure you don't need help?" The officer pressed, a bit more concerned this time. He didn't want to push too hard, but he also didn't want to leave the man to sit there alone if something wasn't right. The elderly man gave a slight smile, almost as if he were amused by the question. "No, I'm fine," he repeated. "They'll be here soon. I've been waiting for years after all. A few more days doesn't matter." The officer's heart sank as he processed the elderly man's words. "Years?" he repeated quietly, unsure if he had heard correctly. The elderly man didn't respond, instead returning his gaze to the window as though he were lost in thought. The officer stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. The man had been waiting for years. That couldn't be possible. He had to be confused, or maybe his memory wasn't quite what it used to be. The officer felt a surge of compassion for the elderly man. If something had gone wrong, if he was lost or waiting for a flight that never came, they needed to help him, and fast. With a deep breath, the officer made a decision. He needed to report this. Something was off. They couldn't let this man continue waiting without knowing more about his situation. But first, he needed to understand the full story. And to do that, he would have to dig deeper, beyond the polite smiles and vague answers, into the heart of the elderly man's mysterious past. The officer, now more concerned than ever, stepped away from the elderly man and quickly radioed for backup. He didn't know exactly what was going on, but something in the man's words didn't sit right with him. He had mentioned waiting for years for someone to show up. Could it be that the elderly man had been forgotten, lost, or maybe even abandoned? The officer wasn't sure, but he needed to find out more. Within minutes, a supervisor arrived at the scene, followed by a few other security personnel. The elderly man remained where he was, still seated, his suitcase beside him, and his gaze fixed on the planes outside. His stillness was almost eerie. The supervisor asked the officer to approach him again, but this time they would be more direct. As the officer returned to the elderly man's side, he noticed that the man's face seemed older and more fragile up close. The lines on his face were deep, and his eyes, though steady, appeared distant, as if he were looking at something far away that no one else could see. "Sir," the officer said softly, "we need to make sure you're okay. We've been talking to airport medical staff, and they think it might be best if we get you checked over, just to be safe. Is there anyone we can contact for you? A family member, a friend?" The elderly man's eyes flickered for a moment, and then he gave a small, almost sad smile. "I don't have anyone left," he said quietly, his voice tinged with sadness. "I've been waiting here for so long. They promised they would come. My children, they promised me." The officer felt a pang of sympathy in his chest. The elderly man's words hinted at something far deeper than a simple mistake or confusion. There was a sense of loss in his voice, a sorrow that hadn't been healed by time. But there was more, much more, that the man wasn't saying, and it was clear that they needed to help him understand his situation before it was too late. "Sir," the officer said carefully, "can you tell us more about what happened? Why are you waiting here? Your children, did they leave you here?" The elderly man's expression softened, but it wasn't with happiness. It was as though he had to reach into a memory he had buried for so long. "I came here years ago, you see," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "I was supposed to meet my children. They told me I should wait here for them. They'd come for me. But the flight, something went wrong with it. It's been years, and they never showed up. I've been waiting here ever since." The officer felt his heart drop as the man's story unfolded. It wasn't just a case of a lost traveler or a man who had missed his flight. This elderly man had been stuck at the airport for so long that he had lost track of time itself. It wasn't just a memory that had faded, it was a life interrupted, one that had been waiting for a resolution that would never come. A moment of silence passed as the officer tried to process what he had just heard. The elderly man had been waiting for his children, hoping every day that they would come back to take him home. But over time, things had changed. The children had likely moved on with their lives, or worse, something had happened to them. The man, however, had never stopped believing that he was still waiting for their return. The supervisor and the other officers exchanged glances. They had no idea how to handle this. The elderly man wasn't lost in the sense that he needed rescuing. He was simply lost in time, lost in a memory that had never been fulfilled. They knew they needed to act quickly. The situation had become more complex than just a lonely traveler. It was a deeply emotional and heartbreaking story of waiting for something that might never happen. The officer felt a growing responsibility to help, but how could they fix what was broken in the elderly man's heart? How could they reunite him with something he had longed for so much, his family? As the elderly man continued to sit in his spot, the security team felt a growing sense of urgency. The story he had shared was heartbreaking, but it raised even more questions. How could this man have waited so long without anyone noticing his struggle? Why hadn't he sought help before? And most importantly, where were his children now? The officer who had spoken to the elderly man earlier decided to take a deeper look into the situation. He gathered some basic information about the man from airport records. He found out that the elderly man's name was Mr. Williams, and he had checked into the airport many years ago. However, no flight had been booked in his name since then. It seemed as if he had been lost in the airport system, an unnoticed traveler who had somehow fallen through the cracks. Feeling a deep sense of responsibility, the officer reached out to local authorities, hoping they could help with the situation. He explained that the man was elderly and had been waiting for years, believing that his family was going to pick him up. He could sense that the elderly man's mind had wandered over time, but the story he told still had a powerful grip on his emotions. It was as if he was clinging to a promise made long ago, a promise that had never been fulfilled. Soon, a team of professionals arrived at the airport, including social workers and medical personnel. They examined Mr. Williams, making sure he was in good health and asking more about his story. As the interview continued, the elderly man repeated the same phrases. He didn't seem confused, but his memory was clouded by the passing years. He spoke of his children in a way that suggested they were still very much a part of his life, even though, in reality, they had long since stopped coming to the airport. The more the team learned about Mr. Williams, the more they realized the depth of his situation. His children had likely grown up and moved on with their own lives, unaware of the promise their father was still holding on to. Mr. Williams had come to the airport years ago, expecting a reunion that never came. And as time wore on, he had simply stayed there, convinced that one day they would show up, as they had promised. The medical personnel confirmed that Mr. Williams was in relatively good health for his age. However, it was clear that his long wait had taken a toll on him, both mentally and emotionally. He had lost touch with reality to some extent, but the connection to his family was still so real to him that he couldn't let go of the hope that they would come. It was heartbreaking to think that someone could be so alone, so disconnected from the world, yet still holding on to the belief that something would change. The officers and social workers had no easy answer. They couldn't simply send Mr. Williams home to an empty house, especially since he didn't have any recent contact with his family. His story had turned into something far more complex than just a case of a missing person. The elderly man wasn't just physically lost in the airport. He was emotionally lost as well. He had been holding on to the memory of his children, the last promise they had made to him, even though that promise had long since faded away. They knew they had to find a way to help him. But the question was, how could they bring closure to a man who had been waiting for years without answers? How could they help him face the reality that his family might not be coming back? And most importantly, How could they make him feel whole again after so much time had passed? It was a difficult situation, one that no one at the airport had expected to face. But they knew they had to try, not just for Mr. Williams, but for anyone who might be silently waiting for something that would never come. They had to help him find peace, even if that meant helping him let go of the hope he had held for so long. The situation with Mr. Williams had quickly escalated from a curious case to a deeply emotional one. As more airport staff, social workers, and medical professionals gathered around him, everyone realized that they were dealing with more than just an elderly man who had lost his way. This was a man who had been emotionally trapped in a memory for years, desperately waiting for a family that was no longer there. The team now faced the difficult challenge of helping him, not just physically, but emotionally as well. After hours of talking with Mr. Williams and trying to understand the full extent of his situation, the team concluded that it was time to bring in someone who could provide a deeper level of support. A social worker suggested that they contact the local community center, which had experience dealing with elderly individuals who had lost contact with their families. Maybe they could help track down any relatives, or at the very least, provide Mr. Williams with the emotional care he so clearly needed. But it wasn't going to be easy. Every effort to help him brought more questions. His mind seemed stuck in a moment, unable to process the passing years. The elderly man had lost touch with the present, holding tightly to the belief that his children were just around the corner, ready to take him home. He had no idea how much time had passed since that first promise. Meanwhile, a team of airport staff worked to contact nearby hospitals and nursing homes, just in case Mr. Williams had any medical records or family members who had previously been involved in his care. But everything came back with no answers. There were no relatives listed as contacts, and his medical history seemed to be a mystery. It was as though he had been living in isolation for far too long. The emotional weight of the situation started to settle over everyone involved. They could see the toll it was taking on Mr. Williams, who was still sitting quietly, his suitcase by his side, eyes scanning the busy terminal, as though expecting someone to show up. He didn't seem to understand why everyone was suddenly so concerned about him. To him, nothing had changed. His children were still coming. They had promised. He could not accept that they might never come. As the hours turned into a full day, the social workers started to ask more specific questions, hoping to break through the fog of time that had clouded Mr. Williams's mind. "Can you tell us about your children?" one of the workers asked gently. "What are their names? Where do they live?" The elderly man's face softened at the mention of his children, and for a moment, it was as if he was transported back to a time when they were young. He spoke of them fondly, describing their childhoods with great detail. "They were always so full of life," he said, a faint smile crossing his face. "My son loved trains, and my daughter always carried a doll with her everywhere. I remember their laughter." His voice trailed off, and for a moment, there was silence. The workers exchanged looks. The elderly man was clearly lost in the past, unable to separate the memories of his children from the present reality. It was heartbreaking to watch him cling so desperately to something that might no longer exist. One of the social workers took a step forward and spoke softly. "Mr. Williams, we're going to do everything we can to help you. But you need to understand that sometimes things change, and we have to face the truth. Your children may not be able to come here anymore, but you're not alone. There are people who care about you, and will help you find a place where you can be cared for and loved." The elderly man didn't respond at first. He simply looked down at his hands, his face clouded with confusion. He didn't want to hear it. He wanted to believe that his children were coming, that his wait would end. But slowly, he seemed to realize that perhaps what they were saying was true, that his family was no longer there, and he had to face the fact that he was alone. The realization seemed to hit him all at once. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time, there was a deep sadness in his eyes. The weight of those years, of that endless waiting, began to settle in. It wasn't just about the children who never came. It was about the life that had passed him by while he remained frozen in time. The staff stood quietly around him, unsure of how to comfort someone whose heart had been broken for so long. They could offer support, they could offer care, but they couldn't undo the years that had been lost. What they could do, however, was help him take the first steps toward healing, even if that meant letting go of a promise that had never been fulfilled. It would be a long journey, but it was one they were ready to help him begin. As the days continued to pass, Mr. Williams sat in the same spot, now with a quiet sadness in his eyes. The weight of the reality that his children might not come was settling over him, and he seemed to be slowly accepting what had seemed impossible for so long. His posture, once stiff with hope, had softened, and there was a weariness to him now that hadn't been there before. It was as though the emotional burden he had carried for years was finally starting to break through, and he no longer had the energy to resist it. Airport staff, social workers, and medical personnel continued to check in on him, trying to offer comfort and practical solutions. They had tried everything to help him find a sense of closure, and now they were beginning to see that he was starting to let go of the illusion that his family was still coming. It wasn't easy, but it was clear that he was beginning to understand that the years of waiting might have been a way for him to hold on to something that was no longer there. One of the social workers, a woman who had been working with elderly individuals for many years, sat beside Mr. Williams one afternoon. She didn't try to rush him into any decision or push him to confront the truth too quickly. Instead, she just sat there with him in silence, offering a calm presence. Sometimes that was all someone needed, to simply not be alone in their sadness. Mr. Williams, for the first time in days, spoke up. His voice was quieter now, more fragile than it had been before, as though the years of waiting had taken a physical toll on him. "I don't know what I was waiting for," he said softly. "I just thought they would come. They promised me." The social worker gently placed a hand on his shoulder, offering comfort without words. Sometimes the hardest part is realizing that promises can fade with time. "But that doesn't mean that your story is over," she said, her voice calm and steady. "You're not alone anymore. We'll help you find a place where you can be cared for and surrounded by people who want to be there for you." Mr. Williams looked at her, his eyes searching her face, as if he were trying to understand what she meant. He wasn't entirely ready to let go, but there was something in her words that seemed to resonate with him. Slowly, he nodded, as though he were finally beginning to believe that he might be able to move forward. In the days that followed, the staff began to make arrangements for Mr. Williams. They contacted a nearby senior care facility that specialized in elderly individuals who had lost touch with family or had no place to go. The facility was well known for its compassionate staff and home-like environment, and they believed it would be a good place for Mr. Williams to start a new chapter. It wasn't the home he had envisioned, with his children at his side, but it was a place where he could receive the care and companionship he needed. Meanwhile, the airport continued to offer small comforts to Mr. Williams. He was given access to a quiet lounge where he could rest, and the social workers and airport staff took turns visiting him. They didn't want him to feel abandoned in the final stages of his journey. Then, just as Mr. Williams seemed to be coming to terms with his situation, something unexpected happened. On the 5th day, a woman appeared at the airport. She was holding a photo in her hand and looked as though she had been searching for someone. The woman approached the staff and asked if they knew a man named Mr. Williams. She had seen his picture online, and something had told her that he might be the man she had been looking for. The social workers quickly recognized her as the woman who had been searching for Mr. Williams' family. As it turned out, his daughter, whom he had been waiting for all these years, had not forgotten him after all. She had been looking for her father ever since she learned that he had been lost in the system. Through years of searching, she had finally found him. When Mr. Williams was told that his daughter had arrived, a look of disbelief crossed his face. His heart raced, and he stood up, his body shaking. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope again. His daughter, the person he had been waiting for, was standing before him. It was a moment so powerful that no one at the airport could help but feel the weight of it. The reunion was quiet at first, both of them unsure of what to say after so many years. But as they embraced, the years of waiting, the uncertainty, and the loneliness seemed to fade away. For Mr. Williams, the promise had finally been fulfilled. His daughter had come back to him. In that moment, it wasn't just the end of his waiting, it was the beginning of something new. He had waited for so long, but now he could finally look forward to the future with someone by his side. And for the airport staff, who had watched this journey unfold from the very beginning, it was a bittersweet, the reunion between Mr. Williams and his daughter, Sarah, was a moment that no one at the airport would ever forget. The staff, social workers, and security officers who had watched over him during those long, silent days now witnessed something extraordinary, an emotional bridge being rebuilt after years of waiting, uncertainty, and loneliness. For Mr. Williams, it was as if a heavy weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The promise he had held onto for so many years, the belief that his children would come back for him, had finally been fulfilled. But it wasn't just the physical presence of his daughter that gave him peace. It was the emotional closure that he had needed all along, the reassurance that someone still cared for him after all this time. Sarah, who had been searching for her father for years, could hardly contain her emotions. When she first arrived at the airport and saw her father sitting there, waiting as if time had never passed, a wave of disbelief washed over her. She had never expected to find him here, of all places. But now, as they stood together, she felt the relief of knowing that the long search had finally come to an end. For Sarah, this moment wasn't just a reunion. It was the healing of a broken past. She had spent so much time wondering if her father was still alive, if he had been lost to her forever. All those years of searching had led her to this very moment. And in that instant, when she embraced him, all the time they had spent apart seemed to vanish. It was as though no time had passed at all. The years of waiting, the years of silence, no longer mattered. What mattered now was that they were together again. The staff at the airport, who had been part of this journey, stood back respectfully, letting the father and daughter share their moment. They had seen the elderly man's pain and the weight of his isolation, and now they saw the healing that only family could bring. The social workers, who had spoken with him so many times, could finally breathe a sigh of relief. They had helped him find a path forward, even when it seemed like he had no hope left. Mr. Williams, now reunited with his daughter, looked around the terminal with a new sense of clarity. He no longer seemed lost or out of place. There was a lightness in his eyes, as though he had found his way again. He turned to Sarah and smiled, a deep, genuine smile that reached all the way to his eyes. "I never stopped believing," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. Sarah nodded, her own eyes glistening with tears. "I know, Dad," she replied. "I know. I'm sorry it took so long, but I'm here now." As they left the airport together, hand in hand, the airport staff watched them go, knowing that their work had been part of something much larger than they had ever expected. They had been the silent witnesses to a man's journey through loneliness and hope, and now they had seen the beautiful conclusion to that journey. For Mr. Williams, the airport was no longer a place of waiting. It had been the starting point for something new, a new chapter in his life that he hadn't thought possible. As he walked out with Sarah, he realized that the years of waiting had not been in vain. He had been found, and now he had his family back. And for everyone involved in helping him, it was a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness and attention can lead to the most profound changes in a person's life. They had helped a man rediscover his family, but they had also witnessed the power of persistence, love, and the human spirit. In the end, Mr. Williams' story was more than just about a man waiting for his children. It was about the resilience of the heart, the importance of never giving up, and the belief that no matter how much time passes, some promises are worth waiting for.